Here is the thing about Remy Calloway. He was not, by any reasonable measure, the guy you called first. He was not the guy you called second. He was, at best, the guy you called after the first 4 guys had already failed spectacularly, the budget was gone, and someone in a panicked conference room said, "What about that human?" Followed immediately by uncomfortable silence and the slow, defeated nod of a committee that had completely run out of better ideas. Remy's official title was Level 3 Diplomatic Liaison, which was the Galactic Council's polite way of saying he handled the assignments nobody else wanted: trade disputes on methane planets, paperwork for species that communicated exclusively through interpretive stomping. He once spent 11 days mediating a territorial conflict over a moon that turned out to be, and this is not a joke, already owned by a gas cloud that had never once attended a single council session. He filed that report. Nobody read it. He was 34 years old, perpetually underslept, and carrying a thermos of coffee that, according to no fewer than 3 separate Galactic Trade Commission notices, contained a stimulant compound classified as a controlled substance on 7 member worlds. Remy had read those notices. He had also refilled the thermos. So when Commander Vell appeared on his communicator at what Remy's body clock was insisting was 2 in the morning, wearing the expression of someone delivering news they were deeply grateful was not their problem, he already knew. Whatever this was, it was bad. And it was absolutely, without question, going to be his. Commander Vell did not waste time. She was a Vorish, which meant she had 4 eyes, 0 patience, and a biological inability to soften bad news, which Remy had always privately respected even when it was actively terrible for him. "There is a creature loose on Station Mira, 9, she said, unclassified. Approximately 900 pounds. It has destroyed 3 corridors, disabled the primary lighting grid, and consumed, we believe, a significant portion of the emergency ration storage." Remy stared at her. "Consumed? Yes. And the 4 negotiators you sent before me?" Vell paused for exactly 1 second too long. "They were evacuated. Promptly." Remy decided not to push on that one. The xenobiologist on the call was a small, twitchy creature named Professor Ogg, who belonged to a species that expressed extreme anxiety by vibrating slightly, and who was, at this moment, vibrating quite a lot. Ogg explained, in the rapid clipped cadence of someone who had not slept either, that the creature, officially logged as Unclassified Predator Event 7, had been discovered drifting in a damaged cargo vessel. No point of origin, no manifest. It had not eaten in an estimated 3 to 4 weeks. "It was operating," Ogg said, and he used this phrase with the gravity of a medical diagnosis, on pure instinct and adrenaline, and what Ogg could only describe as concentrated biological fury. Every species represented on the briefing call agreed, with remarkable cross-cultural unanimity, that it could not be communicated with. It was beyond reason. It was a wall of hunger and fear wearing a body like a weapon. Remy took a slow sip of his coffee. Then he asked the question, "Has anyone tried just talking to it?" The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that meant everyone on the call had heard him correctly and simply could not process it. Professor Ogg stopped vibrating for a full 3 seconds, which, Remy would later learn, was actually more alarming than the vibrating. Commander Vell looked at him with all 4 eyes. "Talking," she repeated. "Yeah," Remy said, softly, like you would with anything scared and cornered and hungry. Another silence, longer this time. "You are," Vell said carefully, "a very strange species." Remy picked up his thermos. "I know. Send me the coordinates." Station Mira, 9, smelled like burnt wiring and something older, something animal, that hit Remy the moment the airlock cycled open and the escort team stopped walking. They stopped very deliberately, right at the corridor threshold, with the unified body language of people who had collectively decided this was as far as professional obligation required them to go. The station's lighting was out from Junction 4 onward. Remy's helmet lamp cut a narrow column of pale light into the dark ahead. The corridor was wide, industrial, with high ceilings, which he noted with the particular appreciation of someone who had just been told the thing waiting at the end of it was 900 pounds and had already redecorated 3 other corridors without a permit. He checked his equipment. Thermos, full. Protein bar, 1. Standard issue diplomat badge that had never once, in the history of its use, impressed anything with teeth. He left the badge. Behind him, Commander Vell's voice came through the earpiece, tight and controlled. Remy, you understand you have no containment equipment, no sedation, no weapons clearance. Yep, Remy said, and you are walking toward it voluntarily. Also, yep. A pause. I am documenting that I advised against this. Noted, Remy said pleasantly, and walked into the dark. He heard the wretch before he saw it. Not a roar, not the dramatic predator announcement you might hope for, the kind that at least gave you a moment of narrative clarity. It was something lower than that. A sound that lived in the chest, rather than the ears. A sound that very calmly informed every ancient part of Remy's brain that it had made a terrible decision and should immediately reverse course. Remy's ancient brain was outvoted. He came around the bend and stopped. The helmet lamp found the creature in pieces at first. A mass of dark, matted fur. A shoulder the size of an engine block. One enormous eye, catching the light and holding it like a coal. The wretch was pressed into the far corner of the corridor junction, low to the ground, and it was watching him with the fixed, total attention of something that had learned the hard way that the universe was not a safe place. It was also, and Remy registered this with the quiet, clinical part of his brain that he relied on in moments like this, shaking slightly. Not aggression, something else. Something that looked, if you were a human who had spent enough bad nights in enough bad places to recognize the shape of it, a lot like exhaustion. Remy sat down on the floor, cross-legged, right there in the corridor, 3 meters from 900 pounds of feral, unclassified predator. He set the thermos beside him, twisted off the cap, and let the steam rise. Then he started talking. Not commands, not the careful, clinical language from the negotiator's handbook, not threat assessments or behavioral de-escalation protocols, which he had read twice on the shuttle ride over and found spectacularly unhelpful. He just talked. Low and even, the way you talk to something that needed to hear that the voice attached to this particular primate was not planning anything. He talked about his morning, about the coffee, about how the station's recycled air smelled like the inside of a vending machine, about Earth, briefly, the way the sky went orange over the ocean in the evenings, and how he had not been back in 2 years, and how he thought about it more than he told people. He talked about hunger, about how 3 weeks without food did something to the mind that wasn't weakness. It was just biology. It was just the body becoming nothing but need. About how everything looked like a threat when you were running on empty that long. About how that wasn't a character flaw, that was just survival. The wretch did not move. It watched him with that single lit eye, its breath coming in long, slow intervals that Remy chose to interpret as a good sign. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out the protein bar, held it out toward the creature for a moment, then set it down slowly on the floor and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Then he picked his thermos back up, took a sip, and kept talking. The protein bar sat on the floor between them like a tiny, foil-wrapped peace treaty that neither side was officially acknowledging yet. Remy did not look at it. He had learned, a long time ago, in contexts that had nothing to do with unclassified alien predators and everything to do with humans who had been pushed past their limit, that you did not watch the thing you were offering. Watching put pressure on it. Watching turned a gesture into a test, and nobody responded well to a test when they were already cornered. So he looked at the middle distance, kept his voice at the same unhurried, conversational frequency, and let the bar sit there on its own terms. He was talking about a restaurant on Earth, a small place near the port city where he had done his first diplomatic training, run by an elderly woman who had never once in 30 years of operation bothered to write down her menu because, she said, she could tell what you needed just by looking at you. Remy had eaten there alone, on his worst nights, and she had always brought him something warm without being asked, and she had never once made him feel like his being alone was a problem that needed solving. He missed that place. He had not thought about it in years, and now, sitting on the floor of a dark corridor on a broken space station, he was thinking about it with a clarity that felt almost unfair. The wretch shifted. It was a small movement, a fractional repositioning of weight, the way a large animal adjusted when something in its immediate environment had quietly reclassified from threat to unknown. Its head moved, almost imperceptibly, and the angle of that enormous eye changed, tilting toward the protein bar, the way you might glance at something you had already decided about, but were not ready to admit yet. Remy kept talking. He talked about the training, about the early years, about how they had told him in his first diplomatic seminar that the most important skill in any negotiation was knowing when to stop speaking. He had flunked that module twice. His instructor had written in the margin of his assessment, and this was a direct quote, "Calloway has an alarming compulsion to fill silence, possibly a cultural defect." Remy had framed that assessment. It was currently hanging in his quarters on the residential deck of Council Station 4 next to his coffee maker, which was also technically a violation of residential equipment codes. He was mid-sentence about the Equipment Code Tribunal, which had been genuinely one of the more absurd afternoons of his career, when the wretch moved again. This time it was not small. The creature's head came down, slow and deliberate, all that mass shifting forward with a kind of terrible, controlled grace that made every hair on Remy's arms stand up in unison and file a formal complaint with his central nervous system. It moved like something that had been built by the universe specifically to be good at this, all muscle and intent, and it brought that vast, scarred head to within about 1.5 meters of the protein bar and stopped. Remy did not stop talking. His voice did not change pitch. His hands did not move. The only thing that changed was his breathing, which he quietly, deliberately slowed, the way he had taught himself to do in rooms where showing fear was the same as losing. He was talking about the tribunal now on pure autopilot, the words coming out even and calm, while every conscious part of his mind was doing something extremely fast and quiet in the background, reading the creature the way you read a room, the way you read a face, looking for the thing underneath the behavior. What he saw stopped the background noise completely. The wretch was not aggressive. It had not been aggressive, not once, since he had sat down. Aggressive had a shape, a forward lean, a quality of intention that pointed outward. What the wretch had was the opposite. It was folded inward. Everything about its posture was the posture of something that had been spending enormous amounts of energy holding a perimeter around itself because the universe had given it every reason to believe that the moment it stopped, something would come through it. It was not a monster. It was an animal that had been alone and hungry and frightened for so long that frightened had stopped feeling like a temporary condition and started feeling like a permanent address. Remy recognized that. He recognized it the way you recognize something you had once lived in yourself, even if only briefly, even if under entirely different circumstances. That specific flavor of exhaustion that came from spending too long on high alert with nowhere safe to land. He stopped talking about the tribunal. He said, quietly, still not looking directly at the creature, "You have been at this a long time, haven't you?" It was not a question. It did not need to be. The wretch lowered its head the rest of the way, slowly, all the way down until its chin was resting on the floor, and those enormous eyes were level with the protein bar, and it was breathing in long pulls through its nose, scenting the thing, processing it, deciding. Remy waited. He was extremely good at waiting when it mattered. It was the one thing his seminar instructor had never been able to take away from him, the ability to be still inside even when the outside of the situation was loud and dangerous and pressing in from all directions. He waited with the patience of someone who had decided, at some point, that he could not precisely identify that this was going to work, and had simply not left room in his head for the alternative. The wretch ate the protein bar. Not fast, not desperate, with a kind of slow, exhausted deliberateness, the way something ate when it had finally, after a very long time, decided that maybe this particular corner of the universe was not going to take the food away. It was a small, foil-wrapped protein bar, oat-based, with a chocolate coating that Remy personally found deeply mediocre, and the creature consumed it in approximately one motion and then lay still. Remy did not cheer. He did not exhale dramatically. He did not make the moment into anything larger than it already was on its own, because the moment was already enormous and did not need his help. He just picked up his thermos, took a slow sip of coffee, and went back to talking, softer now, about nothing in particular. Outside, through the helmet cam feed that was being broadcast live to a Galactic Council emergency session that had now been running for 40 minutes, 17 representatives of 17 different spacefaring civilizations watched a human sit on a floor in the dark and talk a feral predator into stillness with a protein bar and the conversational habits of someone who had never once learned when to stop speaking. Nobody said anything for a very long time. Professor Ogg had stopped vibrating entirely, which, as previously noted, was the more alarming condition. He was staring at the feed with all three of his eyes and one of his secondary optical organs, which only activated under conditions of extreme scientific crisis, and he was holding a data tablet that he had completely forgotten to write anything on. Commander Vell watched with all four eyes and said nothing at all, which was, for a Vorish, the closest available equivalent to speechlessness. On the feed, Remy Calloway refilled his thermos cap, set it down beside him like he was sitting in a park on a Tuesday afternoon, and kept talking softly to the creature that had destroyed 3 corridors and terrified an entire space station into evacuation, which was now lying on the floor with its eyes half closed, breathing slow and even, making a sound that the Council's audio analysis system would later spend 6 hours trying to classify, before finally, reluctantly, filing it under the closest available equivalent. It was purring. Remy walked out of the corridor 17 minutes later. He walked out the same way he had walked in, which is to say, calmly, without hurrying, thermos in hand, jacket slightly rumpled, with the general energy of a man returning from a moderately productive lunch break, rather than someone who had just spent the better part of half an hour sitting on the floor in the dark with a feral 900-pound predator that had, by all available scientific consensus, been completely and entirely beyond the reach of reason. The wretch followed him, not aggressively, not the way a predator followed prey, all coiled in tension and forward momentum. It followed the way a very large, very tired animal followed something it had provisionally decided was acceptable company, padding along behind him at a loose, unhurried distance, its enormous head low, its eyes half-lidded, still making that sound that the audio analysis system was going to spend the rest of the week quietly losing its mind over. The escort team, who had been waiting at the corridor threshold in a tight cluster of barely contained professional terror, did not handle this well. There was a sound, collective and involuntary, that Remy would later describe in his incident report as a noise consistent with multiple beings reconsidering their life choices simultaneously. 3 of them took a full step backward. One of them, a young Vorish aide who Remy had spoken to briefly on the way in, and who had seemed competent and put together, sat down on the floor without apparently deciding to do so first. Her legs simply reached an executive conclusion independent of the rest of her. Remy stopped walking. The wretch stopped behind him. Remy turned around, looked at the creature for a moment, then looked back at the escort team. "It's fine," he said. Nobody moved. "It's not going to do anything," he added, which was the kind of sentence that was objectively meant to be reassuring and somehow made everything worse. "It's just tired. It needs water, something substantial to eat, and somewhere quiet, in that order." Commander Vell came through the crowd with the focused, four-eyed energy of someone who had been holding a great deal of composure together through sheer force of bureaucratic willpower and was now going to require some answers before that composure reached its structural limit. She stopped at a distance from the wretch that was professionally appropriate and personally very deliberate. "Explain," she said. Remy considered the word explain for a moment, the way you considered a question that was technically simple and actually enormous. He took a sip from his thermos. "It was scared," he said. Vell stared at him. "It destroyed 3 corridors. Yeah, scared things do that. People do that. You ever seen what a frightened species does when it feels trapped with no way out and no one willing to just sit with it for a minute?" He paused. "Actually, you have. You have the documentation on at least 40 cases of it. I've filed most of the paperwork." Vell's expression did something complicated and then settled back into its default configuration, which was controlled and unreadable and somehow still communicating profound exasperation. "You sat on the floor," she said. "Yes. And talked to it." "Yes. About what?" Remy thought about it. "Coffee. A restaurant I used to go to. Hunger. How the recycled air on this station smells like a vending machine." He paused. "The Equipment Code Tribunal of last March. It came up naturally. Vel looked at him for a long time with all four eyes. This was, he had learned, what Vorish did when they were processing something that genuinely did not fit into any existing category they had available. It was the four-eyed equivalent of staring at a math problem where the answer kept coming out as a color. "You were not supposed to be able to do that," she said finally, and there was something underneath the words that was less accusation and more a quiet, unsettled revision of something she had believed to be true. "Yeah, well," Remy said, and left it there. Professor Ogg arrived at something approaching a run, which for his species looked like very enthusiastic wobbling, and which, combined with his current state of scientific overwhelm, gave him the energy of a small appliance that had been plugged into the wrong voltage. He was holding 3 data tablets, 2 of which were already full, and he was talking before he had fully arrived, in the way that people talked when the thoughts were moving faster than the distance. "I need to document everything," Ogg said, slightly breathless, looking between Remy and the wretch and then back at Remy with an expression that suggested he could not entirely decide which of them was the more scientifically improbable event. "The vocalizations alone, the behavioral shift timeline, the physiological indicators. Because if those readings are accurate, and it is genuinely in a calm state, then the cortisol equivalent dropped by approximately 60% in under 20 minutes, which according to every model we have for this predator class is not possible. It is simply not a thing that can happen, and yet I have the data right here, and it is happening. It has happened. It is a done thing that is sitting right there behind you making a sound. My instruments cannot classify." "It's purring," Remy said. Ogg stopped. "That is not a scientific classification." "No," Remy agreed, "but it's accurate." Ogg looked at his tablet, then at the wretch, then at his tablet again. Then he made a sound of his own, something low and overwhelmed, and wrote something down with the energy of a man documenting a personal crisis. The Galactic Council session had technically not ended. It had simply transitioned from emergency protocol into what the official records would later diplomatically describe as extended deliberation, and what was, in practice, 17 representatives of 17 spacefaring civilizations sitting in front of a live feed trying to process what they had just watched with the collective intellectual energy of people who had opened a door expecting one thing, found the entire concept of doors had been wrong. The human species classification file had been opened on 6 separate screens during the broadcast. It was currently sitting on the section titled Conflict Disposition, which had been filed under High Aggression, Unpredictable, Handle with Caution, and nobody in the room could quite articulate why that suddenly felt like it was describing the wrong half of the picture. Representative Thule of the Mekthari Collective, a species with a 3,000-year-old tradition of behavioral xenology and an academic literature on predator psychology that ran to approximately 40 million volumes, had been quiet for 11 minutes. When she finally spoke, she said, "We categorized them as warmongers." "We did," confirmed the representative beside her. "We put them under chaotic and dangerous." "Correct. We have 14 separate council resolutions about managing human aggression. 15. The last one passed in October." Thule looked at the feed, where Remy Calloway was now directing 2 very reluctant station crew members toward the cargo bay to find water and something the wretch could eat, doing so with the calm, slightly tired authority of a man who considered this a completely normal extension of his afternoon. The wretch was sitting behind him like a very large, very unsettling shadow, watching the crew members with eyes that had, unmistakably, lost the quality of threat. "We categorized the aggression," Thule said slowly. "We did not categorize what was producing it." The room sat with that for a moment. "Their capacity for violence is real," said another representative. "From a species that had encountered human military history during the early contact period and had required significant institutional therapy afterward." "Entirely real," Thule agreed. "But look at what just happened." She gestured at the feed. "That creature is 900 pounds. It had destroyed this station's infrastructure. Every model we had said it was unreachable. And a human, with no equipment, no backup, no plan that any of us would have recognized as a plan, sat down next to it and found the thing underneath the behavior." She paused. "They are not simply aggressive. They are aggressive and this, at the same time, simultaneously, as a package." Another long silence. "That," said the representative from the Velnari Dominion, who had been quiet until now and spoke with the slow precision of someone choosing every word like they were diffusing something, "might actually be the more frightening thing." Back on the station, Remy was arguing cheerfully with a logistics coordinator about whether emergency ration protocols covered food requisitions for unclassified predators who were not technically crew members or detainees, and therefore existed in a bureaucratic category the system had no field for. He was winning the argument. He usually won the arguments about paperwork. It was, in the end, the one arena where his particular collection of skills and his alarming tolerance for administrative absurdity consistently paid off. The wretch sat behind him and waited with the patient. Heavy stillness of something that had, for the first time in a very long time, decided to trust that the food was actually coming. It was a small thing. And it was, somehow, the largest thing that had happened on Station Mira 9 inches its entire operational history. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Council updated the human species classification file. The conflict disposition section was not removed. That would have been inaccurate, and the Council, whatever its other failings, took its taxonomy seriously. Instead, a second field was added directly beneath it. It read, "After considerable debate and 4 rounds of revision, see also anomalous empathic behavior. Cross-reference with chaos theory. Do not attempt to predict." Remy was promoted, against his explicit verbal objection, and one written one, to the newly created position of Interspecies Crisis Liaison, First Class. The title came with a slightly larger office, a slightly worse coffee allowance, and a caseload that suggested the Council had been quietly saving up a backlog of situations nobody else would touch. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, with a sigh, a refill of his thermos, and the private suspicion that the universe had figured out what he was for and had no intention of letting him do anything else. He negotiated a habitat arrangement for the wretch within the month. Good sight lines, high ceilings, regular feeding schedule. The paperwork took longer than the negotiation, which he noted in his report with some feeling. He named the creature Biscuit. Professor Ogg put that in the scientific record, under official designation, without comment. He had stopped fighting the things that were true. Biscuit, for his part, had taken to following Remy around the station with the calm, unhurried loyalty of something that had made a decision and was not revisiting it. He was still 900 pounds. He was still, technically, unclassified. He scared the recycled air out of every new crew member who came through the airlock, right up until the moment they saw him trailing behind Remy like an enormous, scarred shadow while Remy argued with someone about requisition forms. And then the fear curdled into something more complicated and harder to name. The galaxy had spent a long time being afraid of humans for the obvious reasons. The history, the weapons, the way they showed up to conflicts with a kind of tireless, unreasonable energy that defied actuarial modeling. What the galaxy had not put in any file, on any system, in any of its 40 million volumes of behavioral xenology, was this. Humans were just as likely to walk into the dark unarmed and sit down next to the thing everyone else had given up on. Not because they were fearless. Remy had been afraid the entire time. His hands had not fully stopped shaking until he was back in his quarters with the door closed and a fresh cup of coffee and no one watching. But they did it anyway. They did it with a protein bar and a thermos and the stubborn, irrational, universe-defying conviction that something scared and alone deserved at least one person willing to stay in the room. That, in the end, was the part that should have been in the file all along.